But to give you a little bit of background, right, because I know we're all not kind of familiar with this, I thought I'd very briefly sort of set the scene, right? So lay out the basic tenets of human evolution and sort of the basic timeline that we're dealing with here, right? So most of us know that the earliest human ancestors evolved in Africa. So about 6 or 7 million years ago, we split off from our most recent common ancestors, the apes. And for a long time, it's sort of an African story, right? So a lot of what happened in the beginning happened to critters that, to grossly oversimplify it, sort of look like apes that walked on 2 legs, right? Little brains, little thoughts, primitive tools, big steps, all right? Somewhere around about 1 million years ago, 2 million years ago, what happened was individuals finally started to migrate out of Africa, okay? So this time we're looking at human relatives that have much, much bigger brains. They have bodies that are much more similar to us. And they leave Africa and start to spread out over the rest of the old world, right? These individuals move into Asia, right? They move into Europe. And so now you have primitive human relatives that exist in pretty much all the quarters of the old world. There's individuals in Africa, there's individuals in Europe, and there's individuals in Asia. And they're all sort of going on their own unique evolutionary trajectory. They all look a little bit different, they're all doing slightly different things in different parts of the world. And the ones that migrate into Europe, okay, the ones that migrate into what is glacial Europe during this time span, okay, so 1.2 million years ago, start slowly evolving into what we think of as Neanderthals, okay? So that's basically how they got there. So the timeline that we're looking at is 250,000 years ago all the way up to about 30,000 years ago. There's these individuals that we call Neanderthals that occupy Western Europe, but all the way out towards Russia and towards the Near East, okay? Now that's not to say that there aren't critters living elsewhere in the world at this time. That just means the individuals that we call Neanderthals are pretty tightly demarcated in Europe and the Near East, right? What do they look like? Well, fortunately, I brought some, okay? So what we have here, see if I can, hello, this is not going to work at all, is it? Sad, sad. I'd like to introduce you to my friend Amud. This is Amud the Neanderthal, okay? This is a particular specimen that comes from Israel. It dates to about 60,000 years ago. And I'm actually gonna kind of pass him around, so feel free to take a peek at him as I talk about his general morphology. We also have, who has our modern human? Could you hold him up, please? Woohoo! It's a modern human for contrast, right? So we're gonna be passing that guy around. Amud is plastic. All right, for those of you who don't know, they don't give original Neanderthal specimens to people like me to hand around in bars. Probably a bad idea, right? They're sort of national treasures, so they go to whatever localized depository museum is closest to where they were found, all right? So Amud resides in the Near East. That guy there on your table while you're eating delicious food is actually a dead guy. So please don't drop him. Those are a dime a dozen dead modern humans, I'm telling you. But we're gonna pass these around. And you can kind of note some of the morphological features that I'm talking about as I discuss. There you go. So one of the first things you'll notice about Amud is how incredibly large the brain case is. Neanderthals actually had an average brain size that easily overlapped with modern human brain sizes. And Amud in particular is the largest Neanderthal brain we've got. So modern humans average around 1,400 cc's. Amud was upwards of 1,800. That's a huge head. We'll talk a little bit more about what they did with all that thinking power in a second. But big, big brain, but the brain is shaped a little bit different, right? When you look at sort of the outline of, say, that modern human, why don't you pass on your dear modern human there so someone else might enjoy him. If you look at the shape of the cranium, or the neurocranium as we call it, it's kind of soccer ball shaped. It's big, it's round, it's globular, right? It's got a nice high rounded forehead. Thank you, Vanna. When you look at a mood, it's more like a football. So a big, long, low forehead that's a little bit pointy in the back, okay? On a Neanderthal, up above the brows, you've got these heavily built kind of brow ridges. And it's kind of hard to describe what the Neanderthal face would have looked like. And the best way I have ever heard it sort of described is if I came up to you and your face was made of rubber, right? And I stuck my fingers into both your nostrils and pulled your entire mid-face forward, right? So it's a face where the entire midsection of the face is yanked forward, right? And on top of that, they would have had this enormous schnoz, right? Really, really big, heavily built nose. What is a nose good for? Does anyone know what we actually use our noses for, other than just kind of the first step is breathing, right? Why does human nose shape vary, though? Is there a biological reason for having a big nose versus a small nose? Warming, thank you. Congratulations, ding, 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 we have a winner. Thank you for playing. Neanderthals had these big, giant noses because they lived in glacial Europe. Right? And so one of the first things that your nose does is you inhale cold, dry air, right? You have a lot of surface area that's wet and warm inside this nose. And if you have a big nose, like a Neanderthal, you could warm up some of that air, right? So their faces would have looked very different. They've got these big brow ridges, big noses. Where is our Neanderthal mandible? Woohoo! Can you find a chin on that thing? Is there a chin? There's kind of a chin, not much of a chin. Who's got our modern human mandible? Where'd it go? Aha, all right. So those two things might go around together, so you might end up passing that off to that next table. One of the things you'll notice about the Neanderthal lower jaw or mandible is that there's really not much of a chin to speak of, okay? So from the neck down, they would have looked pretty much like us, except you wouldn't want to have played tackle football with them. Okay, very, very heavily muscled, right? So when we look at their bodies, we see a couple of things. We see these big, heavy, rugose muscle attachments, okay, which is a pretty good sign that there were large muscles that went with that, okay? The other thing that we see, and this is one of the things that I've done actually a fair amount of research on, is that they have a lot of bone. Right? So your bones are just like your muscles. The more physical activity you do over the course of your lifespan, the more bone your body lays down. And once you know that as a general principle, one of the things that you can do is go back into these archaeological and paleontological populations and reconstruct a little bit about what they were doing just by looking at something like how much bone did they lay down, right? So most of us, for example, have about 5 to 15% difference between our right arms and our left arms just from a lifetime of using that right arm to do things, okay? Neanderthals had about 50%, sometimes up to 70%. We'll talk a little bit later about what they might have been doing to get that level of asymmetry, right? But those are the sorts of inferences you can make from looking at something like how much bone has this deceased individual laid down in their body. The reconstructions of body size for Neanderthals, males were probably about 5'7", 175, 180, and jacked, right? Okay, we're not talking about individuals that have a pot belly, all right? Females probably would have been about my size, about 5'3", 140 or so. I'm positively geriatric for a Neanderthal. They didn't live very long, and we can talk about that a little bit later if you're interested too. But about the size of your average female Neanderthal. Okay, so that's about what they looked like. Some of the really interesting things about Neanderthals are behavioral, though. We know a lot about them, and we know a lot about what they did. And in some ways, they used those giant brains for incredibly sophisticated activities, right? They had fire. not a problem, okay? We know that there was no way they could have survived in glacial Europe without fire, okay? Technologically, the types of stone tools that they were making, very, very difficult to produce, all right? They're very technologically sophisticated stone tools. They were also using things, we find these big and very special situations of rare preservation. We find 7-foot-long spears. They're about 4 or 5 inches in diameter. We have about 3 of them, right? So interesting hunting implements, right? So in some ways they were really, really sophisticated in how they went around in the world making a living, so to speak. Some of the interesting stuff, though, is what they didn't do. And in order to talk about what Neanderthals didn't do, you have to kind of compare and contrast them with modern humans, right? They didn't make any art. All those beautiful cave paintings you see on the Discovery Channel, Lascaux, Grotte Chauvet, Fontaine, all these gorgeous, gorgeous representations of early modern human Paleolithic art. Neanderthals didn't do any of that. They did bury their dead. They didn't bury anything with their dead. When you get to modern humans, you'll see these incredibly elaborate burials where someone went and carved 10,000 mammoth bone beads to bury with Aunt Sally. Like really, really heavy, conscientious thought about what went into this particular burial. Neanderthals didn't do that either. They didn't do things like decorate themselves. Modern humans, particularly early modern humans, are famous for perforating little fox teeth and wearing fox teeth. They would decorate themselves with a pigment called ochre, right? This kind of a red pigment that they'd paint on themselves. Neanderthals didn't seem to do a whole lot of this either, okay? And so this has sort of led to a lot of interesting speculation about symbolic thought, right? About not necessarily having the capacity to do these things in spite of having this big brain, right? Because think about it, right? When you paint a mammoth on the side of a cave wall, all that is a symbol. Everybody recognizes that that's not the actual mammoth, right? That is a symbol of an animal outside in your world, right? And it's a huge cognitive leap to be able to do that. And there's so many things that go along with that for modern humans, right? Being able to wrap your brain around symbols is one of the biggest things you've got as a modern human, right? As a modern human, we don't have any problem with the idea that desk, the word desk, okay, is a symbol for an object. We don't have any problem with the fact that you can use a word in another language that also means desk. So there can also be multiple symbols for a single object. Neanderthals didn't seem to be able to do that very well. And that might have been part of their problem. We don't really think that they had language, at least probably not in this super sophisticated way that modern humans have language. Whether there were precursors for that is kind of hard to tell. We don't. That's why I kind of dodged around it, right? And it's actually, he was wondering how we know that Neanderthals did or did not have language, right? And the thing is, we don't. And this is one of the questions that I hate getting from students, and they ask it all the time, and I kind of run past, like hoping no one will ask it every time I lecture on this. Because, no offense, it's a very good question. It's a very, very valid question. The problem is there's just so much that goes into the creation of language, right? You have to have an adequate amount of motor neurons in your tongue to move your tongue. You have to have the critical areas of your brain in order to create and understand speech. You have to have your vocal cords in a particular position in your throat. A lot of things that have to do with soft tissue. And so what happens a lot in paleoanthropological analyses is we'll do one part of it. We'll go, oh look, here is a lump on the inside of the skull that may or may not indicate this person had a Broca's area, which is an area involved in speech. It's really hard to hit all of those, okay? So people speculate a lot on whether they could or could not speak. It looks like there's nothing really seriously anatomical that is keeping Neanderthals from speaking at this particular point. a lot of the best evidence that they did or did not now comes from archaeology. And that's where I find the most interesting arguments about it is in the sort of realm of looking at issues like symbolism and things like that. But you're right, we don't know. Anyone else? Hit me once, going twice. Woohoo! So the next thing I was going to very briefly talk about before just kind of shutting the whole thing down is that, right? So where did they go and why did they go there? Why did they disappear, right? So at the beginning I told you that the end date for Neanderthals was about 30,000, 28,000 years ago. And the reason that's the end date is because after that, we just don't see anything else in Europe that looks like them at all. Faces of Neanderthals are completely replaced with modern humans all across Europe and into the Near East. The thing is, modern humans got to Europe around 40,000 years ago, based on everything we know from archaeology and from a little bit of paleontology. We have some fossils of them, right? So what does that mean? That means we've got 10,000 years of overlap between indigenous Neanderthals living in Europe and the modern humans who are now evolved in Africa and move out and sort of recolonize this area. And that, my friends, is the stuff that really bad science fiction is made of, right? What happened during that intervening period? Did they outcompete one another? Did they mate? Did they interbreed? These are kind of some of the big hot questions in paleoanthropology today, and they've just recently started to get addressed. Rather, let's rephrase. We've been trying to address them with morphology for years and years and years, and we've just started to make some serious headway with the advent of modern genetics and ancient DNA. Extracting ancient DNA from some of our Neanderthal fossils, so we have some idea about what they look like. And there was a really elegant paper that was done just a couple of years back where they looked at Neanderthal DNA as compared to modern human DNA in Europe, modern human DNA in Asia, and modern human DNA in Africa. And their idea was, if there was interbreeding between Neanderthals and modern humans, who would you expect to have the most commonalities with Neanderthal DNA? Europeans, right? That's where they were living, right? And that's exactly what they found. They found that the highest percentage of commonalities was found in modern European individuals as opposed to modern Asian individuals and modern African individuals, which is a really elegant way of making the argument, which they did make, that inbreeding happened on a level of about 5 to 6%, which is kind of exciting, right? So they weren't out-competed, you know, that was kind of a prevailing, well, I can't say that for certain. They might have been, but I think that's an overly simplistic argument. These were highly successful individuals who had existed for almost 250,000 years in glacial Europe. They were good at what they did, and we probably interbred with them and benefited from that immensely. You can now go and get tested to see how much Neanderthal is in you, right? Oh yeah, no, this is a thing, and lots of anthropologists have done this, actually, because it's something that we're kind of fascinated about. So this individual is now giving me his ancestry profile, showing me that he is 2.2% Neanderthal, and 4.1% Denisovan. Wow, you're more Denisovan than you are Neanderthal. It's a whole nother talk, another weird group of people that lived in Siberia that we have good genetic information about. Yeah. No, this is I think, how much, do you mind if I ask you how much this cost you? $100. $100. So for $100, you can find out, I don't sound like an advertisement here, you can find out exactly how much interbreeding with Neanderthals your particular set of ancestors did.
You said that they lived together, right? They interbred?
They overlapped.
Okay.
So they overlapped in terms of time span. And then there's good evidence, particularly from studies of ancient DNA, that they did indeed interbreed, at least at a low level.
Is there any evidence about what their societies were like then? Like mixed?
Like were they hanging out and throwing barbecues and...
Well, yeah, how advanced was it? Like, did they have hunter-gatherer groups?
Oh yes, no, this was not... No. These are highly mobile hunting and gathering populations, both Neanderthals and early modern humans, right? So at this particular time, we're talking about 30, 40,000 years ago, all the way up to about 10,000 years ago. These were not sedentary individuals. We know that both from the archaeology and from things like just looking at how much bone they laid down in their legs, right? Highly, highly mobile individuals traveling a lot across the landscape. And so I'm a morphologist, right? So I actually don't do the genetics as much as some people I know do. But actually the argument has actually gone in the other way, right? So these, the modern humans are coming from Africa, right? So these are warm-adapted people that aren't adapted to glacial Europe at all. So the argument is that maybe a lot of the genes that we're actually seeing were even at a lower level, but we were selecting for the Neanderthal genes, that individuals that were adapted to living in glacial Europe and without those sort of genes that would have had to do with thermoregulation, had to do with skin color, had to do with a lot of cold adaptation type of stuff, might have been what was actually selected for. Yeah, that's a good question. He's asking when sort of the time frame for glaciation was. So the height of the last glacial period was 18,000 years ago. But there was definitely, over the span that Neanderthals lived, Europe looked totally different than it did today. It was a considerably colder environment, right? So glaciations kind of occur cyclically over the span of this. No, until we find a Neanderthal and a modern human holding hands. He was asking if there was any evidence of cohabitation, and I said I can only dream, because there really isn't. Sorry. That's a very good question. So the first part of the question is good news, right? Most people don't quite realize this. Last time anybody counted, we had 500 different Neanderthals, right? Like everybody kind of thinks that, you know, the fossil record is spotty, and there is some truth to that, right? But as you get nearer and nearer to us, we get more and more individuals. Now those aren't all complete skeletons, mind you, but those are individual marks, right? How much we know about variability? Very little. Because getting the types of preservation and getting people to agree to let you grind up a tiny bit of their Neanderthal specimen is actually kind of tricky. So I'm not really, you know, every day, not every day, but fairly frequently you see additional specimens added. The last time I checked, we'd had DNA from something like 8 specimens. So not nearly enough to really account for variability in sort of a widespread sense.
I have a question.
Oh no.
No. So you mentioned, so we have early modern humans and Neanderthals and Denisovans, and we as people really like to think of ourselves as special. You know, morphologically special, genetically special. How does this understanding that that our tree is very bushy, right? It's bushier than we once thought. How does that leach into paleoanthropology? So does that impact your approach to the science? Whether there's some bias, whether you want our species to be special versus these other groups that cohabitated or hung out down the street?
This is a big question. Yeah, it's actually sort of philosophical. Richard Dawkins once wrote a wonderful short story that I love a lot. It's called Evolution According to the Starfish. And what he talks about is it's basically maybe a 3-page history of evolution. And at the end, the last line is, and then there was the starfish, the end. Because that's what we tend to do. It's a human-biased universe, right? So, at least from our point of view, we talk about evolution as it's this kind of interesting narrative that's traipsing along towards the pinnacle of human evolution, which is modern humans. Oh, yeah, which would make us special, right? And I don't think we're terribly special. What Dr. Holliday is hitting on back there is that there have been many species that were similar to us, but slightly different, that have lived and flourished and gone extinct and vanished, right? We're a little bit better at making pretty paintings, and we're certainly better at creating innovative technologies. What they might have been better at, we're not really sure. There right? So he's talking about big, massive climatic change events, things like volcanoes, being able to possibly affect speciation, right? So what you get is sort of a complicated evolutionary phenomenon, but it's essentially a bottleneck where a large number of individuals die off, and the population has to kind of be replenished by the remaining surviving individuals. And sometimes that will lead to sort of an interesting speciation event. It's called founder effect. Yeah, definitely an interesting topic, and something that people speculate about quite a bit. Yeah. How much longer have we been around compared to other versions of us? Ooh. Well, that's nice. Oh, interestingly, we are just coming up on the time period when Neanderthals vanished. So modern humans, if you give them the long view, if you give them the benefit of the doubt, they probably evolved about 150 to 200,000 years ago at the very outset, right? Which would put them hanging out, would put you here and people like you for about 200,000 years. Neanderthals showed up on the scene about 250,000 years ago and vanished about 30,000 years ago. So, fancy that. Yeah, it's a lot of it's really interesting. He's talking about some of the kind of the genetic profiling that you guys have access to, and being able to sort of submit a cheek swab and find out quite a bit about your own ancestry, all the way down to where your parents might have come from. It's an interesting thing, and there's definitely been some criticisms, and there's some interesting issues surrounding it, but yeah, it's sort of fascinating. That was the modern scientific consensus of the day. So this dates back to a wonderful, wonderful burial, one of my favorite burials. It's an individual from Iraq called Shanidar I, and it's an older gentleman who is, he's had a hard go of it. People have suggested that he might actually be the first Paleolithic amputation, because one of his arms, he's relatively complete, but one of his arms is actually missing below the elbow, and it's really tiny and atrophied. It's clear he wasn't using it a whole lot. And they found on top of him pollen. And so this was in the 1970s, and everybody got really excited and happy, like hippie flower children everywhere were sort of embracing the Neanderthals as part of the clan, right? Upon further analysis, what it looks like is that the burial itself, rodents had burrowed through it. And these rodents were dragging bits of plant matter and flowers with them, leaving little bits of pollen here and there. It's the only example we have out of hundreds of Neanderthals where it looks like there was something, included in that particular burial. And it seems much more likely that it was sort of an accident of deposition and taphonomy. No, that's a good question. One of the things that people have suggested, because they do indeed bury their dead, which is why we have so many, right? So all of a sudden, when you get to Neanderthals, you see this huge up count in the number of fossil specimens we have, and that's because prior to Neanderthals, they were just leaving them out, sort of in the middle of nowhere, and animals would come by and scavenge them and things like that, right? So the key to becoming a fossil, should you ever want to, is get buried as soon as you possibly can, right? So that animals won't come and eat you, and there won't be a whole lot of destruction of your remains afterwards. But there's been a lot of interesting hypotheses about why you might bury an individual. Right? Maybe they just didn't want to have a dead guy in their cave, right? Because we're talking about a landscape in Europe where you have Paleolithic lions. Okay, it's a totally different set of animals existing in Europe than we have today, right? Maybe having a corpse hanging out on your doorstep isn't the smartest way to protect your children. Maybe it had no symbolic function whatsoever. We don't know. We don't. And to be fair, sometimes they buried Uncle Bob, sometimes they ate Uncle Bob. We've actually got a couple of good cases of Neanderthal cannibalism that are sort of interesting unto themselves. So a lot of fuss has been made over this. And the current state-of-the-art way to tell whether or not you are looking at cannibalism is compare the processing of the human remains to the processing of the animal remains at that site. So if you have remains of, say, a red deer to go along with your remains of the Neanderthal. And you can sort of quantify, okay, we have cut marks here, we have cut marks here. Here's where someone has taken a large stone and left pits in the side of this femur because they've busted open this femur to get at the marrow. And that's what you find on your red deer, and you find the exact same sort of pattern on your Neanderthal. It's a pretty good bet that they were also being processed for nutritional means. I don't think so. I would not be willing to go that far. There's no signs of like obvious trauma, although those things can be kind of difficult to determine, right? But there's no real sign that they were taken down for meat. There's a lot of signs on Neanderthals that they were living in a very challenging environment where they would have periods of starvation, periods of high nutritional stress. So we have a variety of ways that we can pick that up from the fossil remains. I think it was likely that when a Neanderthal died, sometimes if you were really, really hungry, just burying 175 pounds of meat didn't seem like the best idea. And this one is going to be me like stepping briefly outside of my role as a scientist and just speculating. You know, one of the things I used to say to people before the sort of genetic evidence, which I find very compelling, actually came out, is there's one thing that we know about modern humans, is that whenever they come in contact with another group of modern humans, no matter how hard communication is, no matter how physically disgusting they find you, no matter how many culturally backward things you do, they will try to have sex with you. It's what we do as modern humans. I'm sorry. I don't think communication would have stopped them. Well, okay. She's interested in knowing how we figure out how old these deposits are. Okay, so there are a lot of ways, and that's a whole lecture on chemistry that has to do with something called radioactive decay that I do like 50 minutes on in my classes. Basically, what anthropologists do is often they cut off a chunk of rock or bone and send it to a reactor where it's processed, and a date comes back to us, sort of miraculously. And the date is based on the decay of one isotope into another. That's great. Actually, there's a very popular textbook from 1957 that has a line drawing, it's one of my favorite line drawings, of a Neanderthal cleaned and shaved and dressed up in a bowler hat with a tie. And the caption underneath says that if you took a Neanderthal, cleaned him up, and put him on a subway in New York, no one would notice. I think that says more about New Yorkers than it does about Neanderthals. But that's beside the point, right? The idea has always been that they're within the range, perhaps at the outskirts, but within the range of what modern humans would have looked like. I see people all the time, call it hazards of my profession, where I'm like, oh man, you look like a Neanderthal. If I could only just feel your skull for a few minutes. Like, this happens quite a bit, right? The modern humans, we could stick them in this room, you wouldn't even notice. Other than being in better shape than most of us are, because these, again, are hunting and gathering populations that would have been highly active. They're eating sort of... they're eating a different diet, certainly, than what we would have. So they probably would have been a little bit more lean than we were. You wouldn't have noticed anything. They would have been quite tall. The first modern humans in Europe, a lot of the males are upwards of 6'2". So they're pretty big. They're coming out of East Africa, right? So they're built like equatorial Africans. They probably would have been dark-skinned, tall, lean, sort of narrow builds with long legs and long arms, but nothing outside of the realm of what we would expect to see for our modern humans. Neanderthals would have looked a little different. You probably wouldn't have noticed him if you'd walked past him on the street, but if you looked closely, you'd be like, wow, that guy's got brow ridges and no chin. Mm-hmm.
Being as mobile as they were, have there been any populations of Neanderthals found outside of their expected range?
Sure. Yeah, actually, fairly recently. So there was a couple of Neanderthals found in Siberia, which blew everybody's mind, right? We didn't think they went up that far. We didn't think that they were technologically capable of subsisting in that kind of environment. We knew they were okay in more southern Europe, right? But Siberia, like, you don't even see consistent colonization of latitudes that far north by modern humans until considerably later, because it takes a lot of technological sophistication to live like an Inuit, right? Like that. It's fairly difficult, right? So just maybe 15 years ago, I would have never have said Neanderthals lived in Siberia. So yeah, maybe we'll find them somewhere even weirder someday. So one of the cool things that have come out of the ancient DNA stuff is that they found the gene for redheadedness among Neanderthals. So there were redheaded Neanderthals. So all those Neanderthals you see sort of in the movies when they depict them as sort of these dirty, they usually have dark hair and dark eyes, are actually not really kosher, so to speak, right? So they probably had fairly light skin and fairly light eyes. Because really, if you're living in a climate with no sun, for a variety of reasons that have to do with vitamin D synthesis, you really want to have lighter skin, okay? And so that's goes back to Carolyn's question, that's one of the big speculations that they have, is that maybe modern humans who would have been dark-skinned, who would have not been able to synthesize vitamin D in these sort of glacial European climates quite as well as someone with lighter skin, when they interbred with Neanderthals, maybe some of those genes for light skin got incorporated into the modern human gene pool, and that was sort of the genetic material that we were taking advantage of. We don't know, right? We don't know exactly. I can't pinpoint a time for you when light skin showed up on the scene, because it's all soft tissue and it doesn't preserve very well. But yeah, those things would have definitely been happening over the course of about 30,000 years as individuals evolved in context in Europe. Light skin is because basically all of vitamin D that you get, a large portion of it, is synthesized through sunlight on your skin, right? So if you have a lot of melanin in your skin, if you have sort of darker skin tones, you're protected from sunburn, right? But you're basically evolving in a much more high light context where you kind of get this like nice balance between being protected from sunburn, protected from skin cancer, but still being able to absorb as much vitamin D as you need in order to avoid getting all sorts of terrible problems that go along with not having enough vitamin D. Things like a disease called rickets, which bows your bones and causes all sorts of difficulties and problems, right? So basically, everybody's skin color, if you want to think about this, at least if we put you in the original context that your ancestors evolved in, is a perfect compromise between getting enough light and avoiding things like sunburn and skin cancer. Whether that's correlated with anything else, man, that would just be me standing up here saying I'm a scientist and just daydreaming about stuff. You could do as good a job of it as I could. And I'm kind of unwilling to go there. Yeah, but it's an interesting question. Certainly something to think about over a cocktail. I'm sorry, the question was, what's the highest percentage of Neanderthal that you might see on one of these personalized sort of genome analyses that you can buy for about $100? And I said the highest I'd ever seen was 7%.
I don't think there are any more questions, so let's thank Dr. Libby Cowgil.